finished here today. So I do see that little record button, and we'll go ahead and get started with the drive, chip, and putt. So for this segment, we're going to do setup, rules, and regulations. There are kind of three different sections I'm going to go over. One is going to be frequently asked questions from parents. Another is going to be rule situations that could happen at your local qualifier and what the next steps are to kind of handle those. And then the last section is going to be setup tips and ideas for that. Before I get started, does anybody have any questions either from last week's webinar or that you may have from last week in general? No questions? Perfect. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So we are going to go over some frequently asked questions from parents. The number one question that we get and that you might get on site is age divisions. So this one is a hot topic, especially if the dad registers the participant and the mom is the one that brings them. They might not be aware of how age groups are determined, but they are based on the date of the final championship for this qualifying season. That is April 4th of 2022. So if, like, for example, if I'm a player, my birthday is in December, I might be 11 years old this summer, but I would be playing in the girls 12 to 13 division because my birthday is in December, and by the time April 2022 rolls around, I will be 12. So this causes some confusion for parents, but it is posted in quite a few different places on the website this year. But again, if parent A registers them and parent B brings them, you may still get this question. But their kid is not playing up. They are still competing against kids that are within a year of that child because everybody will be at that age on the date of the final championship. Another question that we frequently get is, what is the weather policy? So it's very similar to a regular golf event for the weather policy, except this year we do want to be a little bit more cautious because COVID is a factor in things, that we will like to call the weather delay a little bit earlier than we normally may. But if there is lightning in the area, you do want to pause the competition. We do really try to finish the competition the same day. So it's an instance where if we're starting earlier in the day, then there might be a 1 or 2 hour rain delay. But if there is daylight issues, then we can definitely talk next steps once we get to that. But with COVID, we are right now asking all of the parents and players to wait in their vehicles if there is a rain delay, and all communications will be made via email. So if you do get into a situation where there is a thunderstorm, and let's just say I'm not on property, I do plan to attend almost all of the drive, chip, and putts, but there are 1 or 2 that we may have some staff and section scheduling issues with. But if we do get into a situation where I'm not on property, I can always help with those communications. So if you want to take care of making sure the parents and players are evacuating the area, you can always give me a quick call or shoot me a text or an email, and I can handle all of the communications that will go out to the parents and players on when to pause competition and when to restart that competition as well. But we do ask them to wait in their vehicles. That way we aren't creating a lot of people gathering indoors for an extended period of time. Another big question that we get a lot is, how long will the competition take? A lot of parents might be using their lunch to take their kids to this competition, and they'd like to know kind of how quickly could they get back to the office. But it does take about 15 minutes for a kid to go through all 3 stages. So once they start the competition, it's pretty quick for them to finish. And then we do try to do awards immediately after the age group is finished. So they can either stay for awards, but they don't have to, and they can always pick up their award at a later time at your facility if they are in a time crunch there. Registration has closed. Can I still enter? So unfortunately, once registration has closed, it is closed. Registration closes 5 days prior to the event at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And this year, we are not going to have the ability to open and close that registration like we may have been able to do in years past. There are drive, chip, and putt liability waivers and COVID-19 waivers that we do have to have the parents sign off on. So registration does need to be done online, and they cannot register after the event is closed. One of the things that we're going to try to communicate as much as possible this year is how many will be advancing from a local qualifier. Because we have increased, almost doubling our local qualifiers in the state of Michigan, only 2 players in each age and gender division will be advancing to the sub-regional. That is a change for the players. So if you are one of the host sites who has hosted in years past, this might be something that comes up more frequently at your facility. Because in years past, it was 3 players advancing from the local to the sub-regional. But again, because we did almost double the amount of local qualifiers we're hosting here in Michigan, we did need to reduce that number to 2 so that the sub-regional field is a little bit more fair and the regional field will be set as well. So that is the reasoning behind that. We want to make sure that everybody who is at that regional had an equal opportunity to get there. Which means they're competing against the same number of kids in the sub-regional level as well. So that is a big change for some of our players, and we're going to do our absolute best to communicate that to all of our parents and families so that it is not a surprise for them when they get on property. Another question that we get a lot is, can I enter more than one local qualifier? Once you compete at one event, you cannot attempt at another local qualifier, but you can register for one local qualifier and change your mind. Let's say you registered for the Treetops local qualifier, but your family's pretty busy the day you registered for it. Something came up, mom and dad had a family emergency, and you need to change your qualifiers. You can change qualifiers. They may be able to pick a different one in that area, like Bay Meadows or Boyne. So that you can change local sites after you change or after you register, but you cannot attempt and compete at more than one local qualifier. And I believe this is the last one for frequently asked questions. But one of the ones is, can I change my sub-regional site? Unfortunately, you cannot. The road to Augusta is set in stone. So once you advance from a local qualifier, you cannot change your sub-regional and you cannot change your regional. And the reason behind this, again, is so that we keep those regionals and sub-regionals pretty fair throughout. So if we had 10 kids from boys 10 to 11 who switched their sub-regional qualifier, in Michigan, we have 2 sub-regionals. So we may end up with one boys 10 to 11 group where only 10 competitors are competing, and another one where there are 30 competitors competing in that age group, which is pretty unfair. Which is why they cannot change their sub-regional or regional, is because it does mess up the number of competitors in each age division, making it easier for one and harder for another. So we do really try to avoid that. As it is right now, there is an equal number in both sub-regionals in the state of Michigan, which is why we can't have people switching back and forth. And then the last question we get quite often is, can a parent give advice to the player? And the answer is no. The way that I like to handle this situation is if a parent, is a little bit overbearing and trying to give a ton of advice, I try to, pull that parent aside and say that at the Drive, Chip, and Putt, we really want to promote self-confidence and independence among all of our players. And we'd really like the players to be able to make these decisions on their own because it's a learning experience for them. And we're trying to build stronger athletes and independent kids. So once that player does start the competition, the parent cannot give advice, and that does include telling them what club to hit and how to read a putt. The only time that we are allowing the parents to kind of help the players through the competition is in years past. If a player had trouble teeing up the golf ball at the drive station, we'd have a volunteer help them. But with COVID concerns, we would allow a parent to help them. So some of our younger or beginner players may be a little bit nervous and having some trouble teeing up the golf ball on their own. So we would allow a parent to help with that throughout the competition. So I'm going to pause there. Does anybody have any questions on some of our frequently asked questions or those situations?
Chelsea, this is Richard here. I had a question. So the kids can tee up, or if they need to, with the parents. If there is another extenuating circumstance, as far as a player maybe having some special needs or accommodations, how is that handled? Do we just contact the section, or how does that work?
Yeah, if there are any special needs or accommodations or anything like that, we definitely encourage the parent to be involved. The thing that we just want to stay away from is the parent doing the competition for the child. So reading their putts, telling them what club to hit, making the decisions for the child. But if there's a situation where there's a mobility issue or the child needs some additional assistance or may need things explained to them in a different way, we always encourage the parents to be involved, especially if we're dealing with special circumstances. The thing that we just want to stay away from is those advice situations, those helicopter parents, the people who are making decisions for their children. That's what we'd like to stay away from.
Thank you.
And Tony, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
Yeah, Charles. So I know we don't want them to give advice, but is there a penalty? I mean, how is that handled? If is it like a one warning, or how do we handle that situation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I will leave it up to, there is definitely room for interpretation on how to handle those situations. My typical rule of thumb is one warning, and then I ask the parents to stay away from the competition zone. So it would be a warning, and then they can no longer watch their child compete, and they'd need to wait at the scoring area. However, I do know that especially at some places, those relationships can get kind of tender, and it can be a tricky situation. So I will leave it up to all of our head professionals, our host professionals, our support staff on the best way to handle that situation. There is not a penalty per se that's like, here's exactly how you handle it in the operation manual. But you can do things such as removing the parent or giving the child a 0 for an attempt at the skill that they were given advice at. So those are the two courses of actions you can take. You can give them a 0 for that attempt, and you can remove the parent from the competition area.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Any more questions about that situation? Perfect. So we're going to move on to some specific rule situations that could happen during competition. So the situations I've laid out in this PowerPoint is things that have actually happened to me and happen more frequently than you'd love them to, but they do happen throughout the season. And this is how I would handle it. All of these situations are open to interpretation. So this isn't exactly step by step, you must follow this protocol. A lot of these decisions can be made by yourself, but this is just kind of an outline of what I would do in this situation to kind of help walk you through similar situations. So one of the ones that happens the most often, this is definitely one of the situations that we try to avoid, is a player comes up to you at scoring and they tell you that at the drive station, their score was recorded wrong. So this does happen. This is why we do recommend the people at the drive station calling out loud the points and the yardage. It does help avoid the situation, and a parent or a player could speak up if they think that's wrong at that point in time and help correct it when that happens. But let's say that they either didn't call it out loud, or the parent didn't hear, or the player didn't speak up at that point in time. This is how I would proceed with a child telling me that they think their drive scores were recorded wrong. So the first thing I would do is I'd walk out. I would either radio or walk out to the drive station. It does help to kind of walk out and do it in person. And once you get to the drive station, I would pause the competition in between players. So let the person who's actively hitting finish all 3 of their attempts before you pause competition, because you will need to speak with all of the volunteers there. And it is going to be a little crazy if you're trying to have kids continue to hit attempts and speak to some of the volunteers. So I would completely pause that competition, making sure that that player's hit all 3 attempts so that you're not pausing it right in the middle of their attempt at that station. And then I'd look at that clipboard that the volunteer should have. The volunteer should have a clipboard where they're recording the scores on the clipboard in addition to the child's scorecards. And I would the first thing I'd look at is, are the scores the same? So is it the same on the clipboard and the same on the scorecard? If it is the same, then I'd kind of go down to the next steps. If it's not, then I'd go with the higher point value for that one. On the volunteers clipboard, we do recommend recording the yardage and the point value. This way we can have a really good way to tell the parent, it went 152 yards, it was 11 points. That's how we got the point value. So I'd make sure that the yardage was converted correctly to the point value. Let's say it was 152 yards, and that's actually 12 points, not 11. Then it's an easy way to correct that mistake as well. And I would just verify that the yardage is converted correctly to the point value. If it is, and the clipboard is right, the yardage matches the clipboard, it matches this, the yardage is converted correctly, the clipboard matches the scorecard, then I'd ask the drive team if they remember having any issues being able to score a golf ball. So was the rangefinder acting up? Was it difficult to see a golf ball? Did they get confused and lose one? Did they have any issues scoring golf balls on the driving grid? If they say no, everything was normal, then I'd come back to the child and let them know that we've double-checked their scores. Everything is correct, and the score on their scorecard will remain valid. If anything is abnormal, so if the scorer had a really hard time lasering the golf ball, let's say the battery died and they don't think they did it well, if they had a hard time seeing it, this is where I would, if I'm not on property, hop on the phone and give me a phone call, because we are going to have to walk through some next steps on this one and see what the best course of action for this specific scenario is. I would need just a few more details on what exactly happened so that we could talk about next steps. But we don't do redos. So we would not have the child re-hit those golf balls at the drive station. What we'd normally talk about is what led to the error, and if we think we can come up with a fair adjustment of points, or if we just stick with what was on the scorecard. And then at that point in time, we'd talk about how to make sure that it doesn't happen for other age groups. So it is a tricky situation. It does get difficult. Most of the time, the issues are just the recorder either put 150 yards and they wrote the wrong point value for the yardage, and everything's pretty simple and easy to fix. But if it is, a really difficult situation, either I should be on property or I'm just a phone call away and we can walk through what happened. We do want the kids to have a fair experience, and we want them to walk away with a really positive experience. But we can't have kids redoing their shots. So we will have to kind of talk about what we think is fair for the competition. Does that make sense? And does anybody have questions about this specific rule situation? I know it's a tough one. Perfect. We'll get on to the next one. The next rule situation that can happen is a player will come up to you at scoring and say, I made my chip or my putt and I only got 20 points. So this is another situation where I would walk out to the station, pause competition, making sure I'm not interrupting anybody's attempts. So waiting until that player has finished all 3 attempts. And then I'd like to talk to the volunteers. I'd like to pull them aside a little bit away from other parents and players so that, they don't get embarrassed or say something that alarms a parent or player. But I'd ask them, how many points are you recording if a putt or a chip is made? If they say that they have been recording 20 points, that is an unfortunate situation, but they have to continue to award 20 points for the remainder of that age group. Once the age group is finished, then they will need to change it to giving 25 points for a made chip or putt. And the reason behind that is if I'm a competitor, I'm girls 10 to 11, I made a putt and I got 20 points. And let's say my friend Alyssa is a girl 10 to 11. She made a putt. She went after me and she gets 25 points. We're directly competing against each other. And that creates a really unfair situation. If she got 25 points for the same thing that I did where I got 20. So we would need to keep that consistent until the age groups change. So if I'm a girl 10 to 11, they catch the mistake at the next age group, let's say is girl 7 to 9. There's no way a girl 10 to 11 would ever be competing against a girl 7 to 9. So it's okay to change back to the correct way of awarding 25 points. The thing that we would have to explain to the parents is just a mistake was made, but it was made consistently among your age group. So, it's not going to affect the people who you're directly competing against, and just apologize for that mistake being made, but reassuring them that, it's consistent across the board and that it wasn't just them that it happened to. Another situation is in this one is if they just wrote it down wrong. So if they've been awarding 25 points and they just accidentally wrote it down on their scorecard, that's an easy fix. Change it to 25 and you can move on. But just making sure that you ask that volunteer how many points that you're awarding for a made chip or a made putt, and letting them tell you really helps clarify what happened in that situation. Do you have any questions about the made chip or putt? Perfect. Specific rule situations, again, this is really frequent question and a little bit of a situation. Just letting the volunteers know the answer to this is, can I place my ball at chip or putt? And the answer is yes. They can replace the ball as many times as they want. They can line it up using whatever lines they have on their golf ball at both chip and putt. The only thing we want to make sure of is that the kid is doing so in a timely manner, that they're not sitting there for 10 minutes reading the putt on every single angle, lining up the ball, checking it again, lining it up again. So it does need to be a little bit of a timely manner. And in a situation where a kid's taking just a little bit too much time, you can just remind them that they have about 40 seconds to hit each shot. And it kind of helps kick them in the buns and get them moving a little bit quicker, just reminding them that they have about 40 seconds. So another specific rule situation that happens quite often at the drive station is a child accidentally knocks the golf ball off the tee before swinging. They might be adjusting their golf club or lining it up or taking a practice swing, and the golf ball gets knocked off the tee. In this situation, a stroke has not been made. So just like the rules of golf, a stroke being made in an attempt at a drive, chip, and putt, there does have to be the intention to hit the golf ball as well as a swing being made. So if it is an accident that they just knocked it off the tee, they can replace it onto the tee and continue with no penalty. Again, we just have to make sure that that was an accident, that they did not intend to swing and hit the golf ball. And if it was truly an accident, it's fine. Pick the golf ball up, re-tee it, and continue on. If you get in the situation where a player whiffs at the drive station, so they intended to hit that golf ball and they missed, then a stroke has been made and the player will receive a 0. This is kind of a rattling situation for the kids. So if this does happen, just encourage them to take a few deep breaths, take a couple of practice swings, take a step back, and then continue on. But they will receive a 0 for that attempt if they do whiff So they intended to hit the golf ball and they miss. So this, again, this specific rule situation goes back to some of the FAQs. So a parent arrives and they've signed up one child, but they did not sign up the other, and they both want to compete. How do we handle this situation? Again, unfortunately, we cannot take day of or walk up registrations. The parent does have to sign off on a few waivers, which is one of the reasons that we cannot take these walk up or day of registrations. But here's how I would handle the situation. What I've done in the past is I've given the unregistered child a tea gift, and I've encouraged them to sign up for a different local qualifier. And if that other local qualifier doesn't fit their schedule, it can get kind of tricky. But I would also invite the child to stay after the drive, chip, and putt competition and go through the stations unofficially. So a lot of times they just want to do what their older siblings doing. They get on property, they think it looks fun and exciting, and they just want to be a part of it. So we really try to encourage them to be a part of it in some way by giving them a tea gift and encouraging them to stay after and go through the competition, maybe with their big brother, big sister, even having their parents go through it with them. But if they can stay after and go through that competition, normally that makes them feel a lot better and included. And you should have plenty of tea gifts so that you do have a few extras that you can hand out to those brothers and sisters who might show up. So those are all of our kind of situation, frequently asked questions and kind of how to handle those. Do we have any questions about rule situations or FAQ before we move on to setup tips? All right, so we'll keep plugging along here. So for the setup portion of this, I am just going to go over some tips and things to think about. And we'll get into a lot deeper dive on how to actually use the equipment at some of the in-person trainings. Again, I will be videoing a lot of those. So if you aren't able to attend an in-person training, please let me know, and I can set up either a call or get you over some more detailed videos and information on that. But these are just some good things to think about as you go through setting up a DCP. For the registration, this should be the first station that you set up. It should be open and ready 45 minutes before the competition. If at all possible, try to get some shade for the volunteers, either using a tent or the side of the building that gets a little bit less sun. But they will be out there for a few hours. So if we can't get them shade, they definitely appreciate that. At the registration spot, this is a great area to have multiple tables. It's nice to have one for the volunteers to sit behind and another table for the tea gifts and the items that the players will be picking up when they're there. Registration should be outdoors. All of our stations should be outdoors for this season, especially with COVID. We'd like to avoid people coming into the golf shop if at all possible. And gathering there. Obviously, we want to steer them in to do some shopping and whatnot, but we'd like to avoid them gathering in there just for the sake of registration. And then we do recommend having registration in a really obvious place that's front and center at your facility that you can see from the parking lot so that parents know that's exactly where I need to go. If you have an area where it's not really possible to have registration front and center by the parking lot, we recommend just using some proxy signs or some hole signs that you have at your facility and writing drive, chip, and putt registration and putting a few arrows. If I am on property for your event, I do have some signs with arrows that I will have in my van and I can bring as well. And if not, they can be as fancy or just handwritten in Sharpie as you'd like, but anything just to help guide people around the facility, especially if this is their first time. One of the things I like to avoid is a parent walking up to some of your cart staff or any of your staff and taking them away from their job responsibilities to answer the question, 20 times in a day of where do I go for registration. So the more signs you can have out there, as informal or formal as you'd like, the better, just to help ease that stress on any of your staff and leaving them open and available to answer their regular questions. So those are some tips for the registration table. So we have some general best practices for the drive station. And I'll also get into the 2 different methods of setting up the drive station as well. But these are just some general ones. So the drive grid does not need to be fairway cut grass. So you do not need a full fairway length that's 300 by 40 yards. It can be rough. There can be a bunker in the way. There can be trees out there. We like to reduce the amount of obstructions that are in the area. But if there's a cart path that crosses, a bunker that leans in, some branches, it's okay, as long as it's fair for everybody. If there are removable obstructions, so a 150 sign or flags or something like that at the driving grid, we would like to remove them. But if they're immovable obstructions, it's okay if they're in the grid, and it does not need to be fairway length the entire way. For best practice, it is easiest to set up the 300-yard signs first. This way, you make sure the grid fits in the area that you're looking at. If you start at the 50 yards and work your way out and realize that at 300 yards you're in the middle of a lake, then you kind of just wasted 20, 30 minutes of your staff's time. So it is really helpful to set both 300-yard signs up first. If you have 2 staff that are setting up the drive grid, you can have one at the teeing ground helping measure, and one person out there setting the flags. They would set, the left-hand side 300-yard marker and then scoot over to the right so that you can see that full 40 yards by 300 grid, and then just slowly work your way in. The person who's at the tee box would help just make sure that you're keeping the signage straight, and that they may help out with lasering, so it's a little bit easier for the person who's out there to set the markers. You will have the plastic corrugated signs, so it does just go into the ground like a whole sponsor sign would, except they're quite a bit taller than a whole sponsor sign is. If you have 3 people that are setting the grid, then you can have one at the teeing ground and 2 out setting the yardage markers, one on each side. Just make sure that as you're setting those tee markers, you just want those yardage signs to be in a pretty straight line, so it looks clean from the top of it. That way it gives your volunteers and everybody a really good sense of what is in and what is out. If they're kind of jagged along, it can get kind of hard to tell what is in and what is out. So I always like to line up the signs. That's why it also helps having somebody at the tee ground, helping the person who's setting them move it a little bit left or a little bit right. If you're using a golf hole, this method is, Jackson, you have a question. Sorry about that. I'll go ahead and answer that before I get into the next one.
You were talking about obstructions on the range. What happens if their ball lands on like an irrigation head or a sprinkler head that is in the grid and obviously is going to make it go pretty far?
Yeah, so it is wherever the golf ball comes to rest. So if it hits that and it goes 20 yards farther, they just got a member's bounce.
Okay.
And if it, hits a tree that's in the way and knocks straight down, unfortunately, they just got a guest bounce. So as long as those obstructions are there for everybody, then it creates a fair competitive environment.
Okay.
If it's something that's moving in and out of the grid, that's where it would be a little bit of an issue. But if it hits a yardage marker and they gain 20 yards, then they got lucky.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions? Perfect. So if you are using a golf hole, this method is a little bit easier for your spotters. It's a little bit harder to deal with public play and your golf course being open, but it is easier for competition, the spotters, because there's a lot less action going on. The golf hole should be easily accessible to other competition areas, so it should be close to the clubhouse and close to where all the action is. You don't want, a 15-minute walk out and back, unless you're able to have shuttle services. If you are using a golf hole, and let's say it's a par 5, we have had people move the tee boxes up past the driving grid and turn it into a par 3. And that way it doesn't impact their regular play. We've also had people just have their regular play start on hole number 2. And by the time they're finished with play, it's very likely that we'll be finished with competition, if they're playing a full 18 holes. Just depending on how many people you have at your site. If it doesn't really look like we can fit everybody in that 4-hour window, you may want to put, a little bit of a tee block in there if you're starting people on 2 and it's really important for them to play all 18 holes. So those are some of the creative ways you can kind of get away with using one of the golf holes and still being open for regular and public play. And then if you are using a golf hole, it's typically best to use the tips of the tee box. That way you get enough space to put that 300-yard grid. It's a little bit clearer throughout. And then the tees do stay the same for all age groups, which means if you're using those tips, when you get up to the girls 7 to 9, they're still using that tip tee box, because if you do move the tee markers, you're going to have to move your entire grid. So the tee markers do stay the same for all of the age groups. This may make it a little bit bumpier for some of those 7 to 9-year-olds, as the tee boxes aren't necessarily that fairway cut in between them. But again, if it's the same for everybody, it's the same for everybody. And we consider that fair and okay. Do we have any questions on how to use a golf hole for the DCP? Perfect. So we'll get into how to use a driving range. So this is going to be a little bit more hectic for your spotters. There's a little bit more action going on, but a lot of people just have the space to do it at the driving range, and that's okay too. If you do use a driving range, we recommend that you either do not use the range picker going into that area, or you pause competition. If you need to run that range picker to get some golf balls back, then you would need to pause competition, because we can't have the picker moving in and out of the grid while competition is going, because that would create an unfair situation to some of the players. So if you do have to run that range picker, either make sure that it stays out of the grid, or you'll need to pause competition and maybe have a scheduled break in there specifically for the range picker. If you are using the driving range where regular play and participants will be warming up, we do recommend using the farthest left-hand side of your driving range. And the reason behind this is the typical golfer miss is going to be to the right side. So as people are warming up and practicing and whatnot, it does reduce the amount of golf balls that are going to be coming into that grid struck unintentionally over there. I also recommend potentially having an additional staff member to help monitor some of the kids and the public warming up, just to remind them to aim as far away as possible from that driving grid. If you don't have additional staff to do that, just make sure that the people who are distributing out the golf balls, so your staff inside, is just reminding them as they hand out range balls. While we are talking about range balls, it is okay to charge for range balls for the players. We recommend doing it at a little bit of a reduced rate. So if your normal small bucket is $5, maybe consider charging $2 or $3 for the competition. But it is okay to charge for range balls. We just like you to consider, making sure that we want this accessible to all kids. We don't want it to be a financial burden for anybody. So it's okay to have them out for free, and it's okay to charge some for it too, because I do know it's a lot to pick up. You may have to bring in an extra range attendant for it. So if you're trying to make sure that you have enough people for that, it's okay to charge for range balls. Do we have any questions about setting up drive before we move on to chip? Go ahead, Brian.
I may have missed this in the beginning, and if I did, I apologize. everybody use range balls, or if they want to use their own, are they allowed to do that?
It's a great question. I did not go over that. So really glad you brought that up. It is recommended that you have a big old bucket of range balls at the drive station for the kids. They are allowed to use their own golf ball, but they will not get that golf ball back. So what we don't want to do is a player to go out there, hit a brand new Pro V1X and expect to get that back. Because we don't want the time it takes for the volunteer to collect it and bring it all the way in to be an issue. So if, they are hitting brand new Pro V1Xs out there, then that's the cost of the competition for them. They lose that $12 or $13 it costs for a sleeve of golf balls. And the volunteers might be a little bit excited about getting some new Pro V1Xs. If the golf ball is pretty easy to retrieve, so let's say a girl 7 to 9 hit their really nice, pretty pink golf ball, and it's 20 yards up there, obviously that's not going to take a ton of time for them to go up, get it, and get out of there. That's okay. But we just don't want a huge time delay in trying to retrieve and track down who hit what golf ball where. So that is something that we do tell the kids in the pre-event email, and something that you may want to remind them at the drive station of, is if they choose to hit their own golf ball, they're not getting it back.
Very good. Thank you.
Any other questions about the drive station? Cool. Moving right along. Set up for the chip station. So the chip is between 10 to 15 yards. We do recommend that we're picking a really flat hole in a flat area. And I know that's not always possible, but if at all possible, try to pick uphill slopes as opposed to downhill. This is the absolute hardest part of the competition for all age groups. We see a lot of people walking away with 3 points here, which means they simply hit the golf ball and they didn't get anywhere near the grid. So we do really want to keep that in mind. I do recommend you hitting a couple of chips yourself there just to see how hard it is, and see if there's a better area to put it. We want to make sure that those tee markers are wide enough for a right-handed and a left-handed golfer to have the same line. So it's okay to put them pretty far apart if you'd like. It just gives the kids more options and more space to choose from. And then we also recommend having it in the rough. Now, I know I just said try to make it as easy as possible, and then I also said put it in the rough, which is a little bit contradictory. But again, we really want to avoid the temptation of using a putter, which is why we like to put it in the rough. But let's say at your facility, your rough is super thick and not very friendly. It's okay to put it in the fringe too. It's just something you might want to remind the volunteer of the morning of, is that we can't have putters at that station. That way that they're reminding the kids each time they come up, and we avoid having a putter there. So it's okay to have it in the fringe. I personally prefer it in the rough, but it does depend on every facility. If it's really thick rough, I'd rather the kids have some success there than to avoid that putter thing. We do really want kids to succeed here. It's a good thing if multiple people make the chip. So we're not trying to make the hardest competition possible. We're trying to make one of the easiest competitions possible, because we are going to have 7 to 9-year-olds. And based on the age breakdown, it means some of them could be 6. So having a 6-year-old compete at this chip competition, we still want them to have some success and be able to do it. Another thing to consider while you're setting up the chip is trying to make it in a space that's away from players warming up. So you want this either in a corner of a green or in a space that is completely dedicated just to chip. I know some people don't have that amount of space and they're putting greens, but keeping kind of an eye on how setting up this competition is going to be impacted by people warming up. Let's say that you can't get into the corner or in an area that is away from people warming up. One of the things that I've done in the past is either roped off that area or actually placed physical barriers so that kids who are warming up don't accidentally scull a shot and it's impacting the people who are participating in the competition. Some of the physical barriers I've put up is like a table on its side. It doesn't look pretty, but it works really well. Or putting up a couple other different things if you have them around your facility to make sure that we're just keeping the competition area only for the competitors. Any questions about the chip station? All right. So there are two different ways to set up the putt station. We have a red way and a blue way outlined here. The red way is my preferred method. I really enjoy setting up the putt competition in this way for quite a few reasons. It takes up a lot less space on the putting green. And then all of the putts are on the same line, which makes it a little bit easier for the kid. Let's say you have a little bit of a break to the right at the end. It's going to be there for all three putts. And if you're uphill, it's going to be uphill for all three putts. And it makes it a little bit easier for the kids. One of the things I was nervous about when I chose this method when I first started using it was I was concerned that, there'd be a bunch of wear marks and spike marks all throughout because the kids are walking up and down the same line. And I've used this for a season and a half of regular local qualifiers, sub-regionals, and a regional. Some of those local qualifiers had over 200 kids on property, and we never had an issue with, torn up green or spiked up area where we had to move the tee markers. So I am really confident in this method. One of the things that when you set up in the red method is you'll notice that the tee markers are really wide for the 6 foot, a little bit more narrower for 15, and even more narrower for the 30-foot putt. And the reason behind that is if you kind of use this method where they're slanting in, then as they get farther back, the 6 foot tee markers are now out of the way, and they won't be an issue as the kid's hitting that 15-foot putt to the cup. And same with the 30-foot, the previous tee markers are going to be out of the way, and they won't be an issue when the kids are hitting. If you use the blue method, it's not preferred, but let's say you just want to do it because you like it. And that's okay too. It's your competition. You're going to be setting it up. You can go to one cup and have them in 3 different putts. So you'd have a 6, 15, and 30-foot putt at different angles. One of the things you'd want to watch out for here is the 30-foot putt. We really recommend that being uphill if there's an uphill or downhill choice. If it's flat, obviously we choose that first. But we want this one to be uphill if at all possible because kids are going to blast it by. And if it's uphill, it helps them control their speed just a little bit better. And then one thing to watch out for when you're doing this method is that the tee markers aren't getting in the way. So if you see this 30-foot putt, if the kid hits it more than 6 feet past the cup, they could hit one of these tee markers and have it bounce. So it's one of the things we'd love to avoid if at all possible, which is why the red method is a little bit easier. But let's say you have 3 really great lines that you want to pick out and you choose the blue method, that's okay. Just be cognizant of where those tee markers are and what directions you're putting the putt to and where those tee markers are being placed. One of the things that you should try to avoid if at all possible, which it should be, is using multiple different holes. You really just want to use one hole. If you use 3 different cups for 3 different putts, that means you're going to be having to make additional bullseye circles around the cup, which can get time consuming, and it takes up a lot more space. So we really, really recommend 1 cup for the putt at 3 different distances. That way it saves a lot of time for setup. And by a lot, I mean like 20 to 25 minutes each. But if you just want to be crazy and out there and use 3 different cups, nobody's going to stop you on that one. But I do highly recommend just using 1. Some additional setup tips for putt. Again, we really want to try to keep some flatter lies uphill whenever possible. If you have that choice between up or downhill, it helps the kids control that putt a little bit more. We'd love to avoid any wicked breaks throughout there, trying to just keep it fair and easy and simple. Again, thinking about, having a 6-year-old girl go through this competition. We'd like to set up the competition so that the youngest age group and the least experienced age group still has fun and can have some success throughout here. So we really try to make it as easy as possible. And again, trying to pick a space that's far away from where people will be warming up. The best way to do this is by using a cup that's over in a corner, putting the tee markers back, and that way it's only, that zone that's going to be impacted. Again, if you can't get an area that is going to be away from people warming up and practicing, then using physical barriers or roping off the area can help with that as well. So do we have any questions about setting up the putt competition? Perfect. And the last setup tip is setting up scoring. So scoring should be outside. If there's shade, that is preferred as well. You should be able to have power and internet access when you're at the scoring area. If you don't have power and internet, it will make things a little bit harder. You may have to bounce between the scoring area and the clubhouse for power and internet. It's not impossible though, but it is recommended that you do have power and internet. If that isn't an option where you are, one of the things that we recommend doing is collecting the scorecards outside where you don't have power and internet, and then having a runner take them inside and having the professional enter them into the computer inside. That way we aren't collecting a ton of people indoors again, avoiding a lot of gathering and inside spaces and having people waiting for scoring inside together. So it's recommended that you kind of collect the scorecards and do awards outside and just have somebody running back and forth between the clubhouse to enter in the scores. If you have an additional computer monitor, an additional computer, laptop, or a TV, you can put the scoreboard online. We will not have paper scoreboards this year. That is new for this season, is we are doing all online scoreboards. The scoreboards are accessible on smartphones, which is one of the implementations is kind of our COVID-19 safety protocol. Is we'd love to avoid a ton of people gathering in a small space, which would be around a scoreboard. So we are doing all online scoreboards. You can access it just by going to drive-to-a-putt.com. You can display it on a website or a monitor or a TV if you have that. And if you don't, then just directing the parents to the website on their mobile device would be great as well. The players will not keep their scorecards. So once they sign it and turn it in, do not hand it back to them. We do need you to keep those. And if I'm on property for your event, I'll take them with me. But we do need to keep those until the sub-regional is over, just in case there are any parents calling and saying, hey, my kid's score was done wrong. Then we have that verification. We have that child's scorecard. So we do collect those. If I'm not on property for the event, you can either send them to me, you can pick them up from your facility, or you can just hold on to them until after the sub-regional and then dump them if we don't have any issues. And one of the things that did not come naturally to me at all, being in golf events, normally for like a section tournament or any other tournament that we set up, scoring is set up while everybody's out playing. So for a regular event, at the section we have, after we start everybody, about 3 hours before anybody comes back in, and we use those 3 hours to set up scoring. That is not the case with this competition, which I did learn very quickly when I started running these, is once that competition starts, you have about 15 minutes until kids are coming to you for scoring. So set up scoring before the competition starts. That was something that definitely did not come naturally to me, so I want to pass that along to everybody, is you do want to set up scoring before the entire competition starts. that does give you the opportunity to kind of walk around with that first group, make sure everything's running smoothly, scoring set up, and you're not trying to do that while people are finishing and trying to turn in those scorecards. We will do a whole nother segment once the scoring portal is finalized, where I kind of walk you through how to enter those scores. It should be incredibly simple. I've seen kind of the dummy test side of things, and it is as simple as clicking on the kid's name, entering the scores, and they have kind of made it dummy proof with those scores. So only valid numbers could be entered. So for example, in the putt area, the only possible scores are 1, 2, 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25, which means you can't accidentally hit 17 and hit enter. That's not a valid score. So you should have either a drop down or it will turn red if you've entered an invalid score, to help kind of make that even simpler for you as you're going through the process. And then once you hit save, it is live on the website and on the scoreboard as well. So there are a ton of different ways to do scoring. And I will walk everybody through it once we have that access. And I'll post those videos on the website as well. But that is kind of all I have for you today. Do we have questions about setup or FAQ or anything DCP related? Hey, Ron.
Hi, Charles. Hey, and maybe you'll cover this in the next training segment. The materials for the actual setup, the paint, the whatever needs. Are we getting anything from you guys, or what? How's that all work?
Yeah, so Barker is the company that is sourcing all of our materials. They will be shipped directly to you 2 weeks prior to your event. It does come in one box for the equipment and one box for the tea gifts and everything. The only thing that won't be included in that is some of the paper handouts for the volunteers. And those I will email to you prior to the event, and you'll just need to print them out. So I'll email them to you once you get, once we have kind of the field set. I'll set up all of the different score sheets for everybody. But everything else should be shipped directly to you. It will be there 2 weeks prior to your event. I actually just got my box last week, so I could take around to the in-person training days. So you'll be able to see the equipment if you come to an in-person training day. But most of it's just those corrugated plastic signs like you'd use for a whole sponsor, except they're bigger. And those have like the tee markers and all of the range flags. And then for chip and putt, we have string and chalk, which works incredibly well for doing those circles. And then you'll also have the kids' scorecards, which they can fill out once they arrive on property. And then you'll have volunteer gifts, which would be a hat, and tea gifts for the kids and awards for the kids. And that's all going to be shipped directly to you. And then that's yours to keep. So you don't have to pass it along to anybody else. You don't have to box it up and send it back. It's yours forever.
Okay. So, and will you cover the tricks of how to set up? You know, I know you kind of ran through that with me one other time when you were here, but will you cover that in the next training?
So the next training is going to be mostly just about COVID-19. The tips on actually using the setup equipment, I have them filmed and they're already on the Drive Chip and Putt website or on the Michigan PGA website under DCP host facilities. So right now I only have chip and putt and it's best practices on how to set that up. And it does actually show, you know, tying the string around and rolling it up and doing those circles. So it shows all of that. The only thing that's not on there is driving, and that's because the equipment is completely different from what's in the box versus what I normally use. And I just got my box here a little bit ago. So once we do, either once the snow and the ground softens up a little bit more, or we get to that first in-person training, I'm going to be filming how to set up those drive stations as well, so that you have that always as a resource and you can come back to you know, morning of the competition. The videos are, I want to say, 5 minutes or less on those.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions from anybody about setup or tips and tricks? Well, perfect. Thank you guys all for joining me. This webinar will be posted on the Michigan PGA website here by the end of the day, which is under the junior golf and drive, chip, and putt. And then you head over to the local host site resources. We have our next webinar next Tuesday at 11 o'clock, and that is all on COVID-19 protocols. I will be going over the protocols as it stands right now, but again, those could change. They are the strictest right now, and then they will lighten up as we kind of get through and kind of see what it looks like when May, June, July starts. And then after that, we'll have some in-person trainings. At those in-person trainings, we will actually be live and demo setting up the DCPs as well. So it's a really good opportunity for you to get your hands on the equipment and practice if that's something that you're nervous about, or if you're not quite sure how it works. We will be able to get out there and play with the equipment and set up a DCP. Bring your clubs because we can go through it as well, which is pretty fun. But I will hopefully see you next week or at one of our in-person trainings. Again, if you cannot make an in-person training and it is something that you really love, let me know and we can work on something to make sure that you're confident going into your local qualifier. Have a good